Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight we are continuing with honoring the legacy of Black Americans. It is Black History Month, and so there has been, I think, many Black Americans in my personal life that has impacted me in a very positive way. And I want to commemorate not only Black Americans that are living, but also those that have passed. And tonight we are honoring Kenneth Clark. Kenneth Clark was born in Panama Canal Zone, but moved to Harlem, New York when he was 5. After his mother refused to accept a ruling that her son would be limited to trade or vocational schooling, Clark was enrolled in high school. He went on to earn a master's degree in psychology from Howard University. And this is where Kenneth met his wife. The pair carried out research together, becoming the first African Americans to receive a PhD in psychology from Columbia University in New York City. They also founded children development and youth opportunity centers in Harlem. Clark was also the first African American to hold a permanent professorship at the City University of New York and to serve as president of the American Psychological Association. So you can see he went on to do great things. In 1947, some of his key works, the 1947 work was Racial Identification and Preference in Negro Children. In 1955, he wrote Prejudice and Your Child. Then in 1965, Dark Ghetto. And then in 1974, Pathos of Power. So as you can see, there's a large body of work, and I'm pretty sure that there's much more that he's done, but those were the very significant pieces that Clark went on to do. In the 1930s, Kenneth Clark and Mamie Clark, which was his wife, studied the psychological effects of segregation on African American school children. And the Clarks are famous for the doll test. And if you remember, there were dolls, different shades from white to dark brown, and children would come into the laboratory and they would be asked a list of questions to determine exactly what their preference was, where their racial preferences stood in relation to these dolls. And so the children were from ages 3 to 7. And to reiterate, this test, what it did was revealed a child's awareness and underlying attitudes about race, of course, in the United States of America. And what they learned is that Black children selected the white doll over the darker dolls because they had learned that this was the color most wanted to play with, the color that most said was nice, and the color that they heard was good. So, of course, when they were in this laboratory, they had dolls ranging from white to darker brown, and they were giving a series of prompts where they were asked, which doll do you think is the nicest? Which doll do you think is good? Which doll would you most likely want to play with? And they learned that the Black children chose the white doll more often. And the question that the Clarks asked was, who teaches a child to hate and fear a member of another race? And this test pointed to children learning self-hatred from teachers, learning self-hatred from friends, learning self-hatred, of course, from their peers, learning self-hatred, this internalized hatred was a result of interacting with teachers and hearing their perceptions about race, interacting with children in school and hearing their perceptions about race, interacting with their peers, and sometimes regrettably interacting with family members and learning their perceptions of race. And I think for Black Americans, on this specific note, especially if the Black American is a descendant of slaves and coming, if they have family members that were in the transatlantic slave trade, there was an attack on not only our psychology and psychological well-being, but there was an attack on our personhood and our self-esteem. And so that is thought to have impacted the way, I guess, during this time, during the 1930s, and then, of course, the 1940s, and then going, after that into Jim Crow, that gave children, especially Black children, the feelings of, feeling inferior to some degree. And you can almost, when you think about it, right? So let's take, for instance, the Jim Crow period, where you have two separate water fountains, a water fountain for Blacks that said colored or Negro, and then you have a water fountain for whites. And then learning that the water fountain for whites was cooled, that water was cooled during a hot summer day. And then the water fountain for the colored people or the Negro was unfortunately just hot or lukewarm. It was not cooled. And that can give a feeling of inferiority to some degree. Take, for example, riding in the back of a bus or being told that you have to ride on the back of the bus and that you couldn't ride in the front of the bus, or if a white person entered the bus, you were required to give up your seat, right? And imagine, ladies and gentlemen, what that must have looked like for a child during that time, seeing their parent get up for a white person, having to give their seat to a white person, seeing their parent have to move, seeing white children drink from a water fountain that was cooled and Black children not drinking from that water fountain, learning that there was a difference in treatment for white children going to schools that were well funded, whereas Black children were going to schools that were not well funded, that didn't have the same curriculum that white schools had, that didn't have the same extracurricular activities that white schools had, that Black schools didn't have the same programs and the same internal activities that white schools had. And acknowledging that, learning more about that, not even necessarily learning more about that, but sitting with that, right? Sitting with that. we could almost understand why a child would feel compelled not to choose the dark doll. And it reminds me of a time, ladies and gentlemen, when I was in Canada, and I had this friend who was one of my best friends from Nigeria. And shout out to her. I love her so much. I still do love her. She was one of my best friends, and we got along so great. And one day we were out shopping. It was one of the things that we love to do, is to go and shop. And we would go and shop at the secondhand stores. It was one of our favorite pastimes, where we would go and shop at the secondhand stores, and we would do that a lot. But as we were shopping one day at the secondhand store, there were items that were being sold for less that were outside, and my friend, who is Nigerian, picked up a white doll and was going to buy that doll for her daughter. And I stopped her and I said, "Don't buy that doll for your daughter." And ladies and gentlemen, I didn't stop her because I'm a racist. Black people can't be racist. I didn't stop her because I disliked white people, because I don't dislike white people. I didn't stop her because of any other racialized or prejudicial reason. I stopped her because I knew that that would begin to cause self-doubt and self-esteem issues within her daughter. Indeed, there were already moments where I had recognized that her daughter was starting to feel that she did not really feel that blackness was beautiful, or that blackness was good, or blackness was the color that she should play with as a child. This was, I think, about 7 years ago, approximately 7 years ago, when this had taken place. So you could just imagine what this would be like for a child in the 1930s, a child in the 1940s, a child in the 1950s. And I wanted my friend to buy a doll for her daughter that was reflective of her daughter's skin tone. Her daughter has dark skin. And so I think it was important at a very young age to teach her daughter to love her skin tone, to teach her daughter to that, you know, darkness, having dark skin was beautiful. And I don't know, to reiterate, like I don't know if this was taught, how this was taught to our daughter, like this, thinking that darkness was unattractive, or thinking that darkness, not necessarily darkness, but having dark skin or looking dark was not good. I don't know if the father in Nigeria taught her daughter this, or if this was just, I'm not sure. But I think it starts at a young age. I think it starts at a young age that children learn race. Indeed, Clark acknowledges that as early as age 3 that children begin to understand race, being aware of race and underlying attitudes about race. Clark also found that sometimes white parents may discourage their children from playing with black peers, such as possibly my friend's child, who is black, implicitly teaching them to fear and avoid black children. Interestingly, Clark's research and his testimony was used in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, which desegregated schools in the United States. And I can't help but to reflect very deeply on this research that Clark has done, because I think it teaches us a lot about racial connections and social connections within the world. And I don't think that it stops at I don't think it stops in adolescence, right? I don't think it stops there. I think that we're still learning about race as we get older. I think that not only are we still learning about race, that the Dahl test is being applied even in universities, right? And not necessarily literally, but figuratively. So for example, if a black university student is expelled because they wanted to conduct research on a specific issue or topic, and there is an intensity there with that black student being expelled, then white students can be conditioned to think that that kind of research or research in connection, or that kind of research is connected to this kind of person, which is a black person, and be unlikely to pursue that kind of research, or maybe be unlikely to connect with black students, black university students. I do remember when I was in Queen's University, Belfast, I did not have any white friends or Irish friends. I got along with all of my university students, not my university students, but all of the students in my classes at Queen's University, Belfast. I got along with all of the Irish students, and I got along with all of my professors, but my friends in the university, or people that I talked to or decided that felt connected to, that we came together, bonded together, they were not Irish. They were from China, they were from Panama, they were from Vietnam, they were from Thailand, they were from India. None of them were Irish. None of them sought to befriend me. No Irish student at Queen's University ever invited me out for drinks. I don't drink alcohol, I'm a teetotaler, but never invited me out for drinks, didn't invite me out for lunch, didn't befriend me. Most of the people that did do that were minorities. So it raises an important question as to whether or not there is, if this is still happening, whether children are being conditioned at a young age to avoid minorities in Northern Ireland, or to avoid Black students, because there has been segregation here in Northern Ireland. And my perception, this is just my personal perception of Northern Ireland, I sort of feel that whereas the United States is in 2026, Northern Ireland, and don't forget this, like, keep in mind that United States is an extraordinary racist country. It is racialized in every aspect. But in 2026, Northern Ireland feels more like the 1950s, the 1960s, if not the 1950s, between the 1950s and 1960s. It really does. It feels like that period. And I was not born in that period, but just reading the literature about that period, listening to stories about that period, and understanding like the segregation and the nuances that have taken place and the events that have taken place during that period, makes me feel that the era that Northern Ireland is in is within the 1950s and 1960s. It's really not a racially conscious country. And that is not a dig on Northern Ireland. That is not a dig. I think that there is a lot that we could learn about race. This is not me being passive aggressive and saying something negative about Northern Ireland, but I think what's different from the United States than what's different from Northern Ireland is that in the United States of America, racism in general is very overt. It's an overt practice. Indeed, we had several events in the past, such as slavery, which was an overt practice, Jim Crow, an overt practice, Black Codes, overt practice, mass incarceration, and overt practice. All of these institutional and systemic ideas that impacted the livelihoods of Blacks were overt forms of racism. Whereas in Northern Ireland, racism is covert. Now, you may have a pocket of persons that will write graffiti, racialized messages, or come out and throw bricks in to the houses of minorities, and that is to be condemned. Those are overt forms of racism, but that is very small compared to the covert forms of racism, which is the most insidious here in Northern Ireland. The overt forms of racism, I think, for the diaspora communities within Northern Ireland is, I think, within the diaspora communities here in Northern Ireland, the overt forms of racism of what I just described is what they know, and that in some respects they are quite shielded, if not blinded, to the very covert forms of racism. And I think that this covert racism that is permeating through institutions here in Northern Ireland, even through communities, I think it deserves broader discussion about how to handle it. Again, when I went to the symposium on Let's Not Talk About Racism, the research output that was being introduced to us at that symposium was overt forms of racism. It was very overt forms of racism. And I stopped and said, the most insidious form of racism is the covert racism. And I wanted to hear more about that, which we didn't get an opportunity to talk about. And hopefully we will. Hopefully I will be able to have a discussion about that with others one day. But ladies and gentlemen, I just wanted to give Kenneth Clark his flowers. Again, he raises a very important question. Who teaches a child to hate and to fear a member of another race? He was born in 1914. He died in 2005, and he and his wife will forever be remembered for the amazing body of work that they put out for us to build on, such as academics and scholars. And what I want to know is there a psychologist or scholar that has changed the way you view race? Is there a scholar, a psychologist, or a professor that has given you some insights about racism or understanding racial attitudes? I know that a lot of the research in this area, is still developing, and that's okay, because I still would want to know exactly if you're a scholar out there, or if you're a professor out there and you're developing ideas about racism and learning more about that and how it impacts us. I would really want to know. I would really want to know exactly your input on that. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. We'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.